The gavel fell like a gunshot. Every camera in the House Oversight Committee chamber swung toward the witness table, where Karoline Leavitt, 26 years old, blonde, polished, and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from surviving the Trump White House press rooms, sat with her arms crossed and a smirk playing at the corner of her lips. She had just done the unthinkable. She had challenged Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to a debate, right there, on the floor, in front of C-SPAN cameras, a packed gallery, and a nation already drowning in political theater. "I've heard enough of your partisan spin, Congresswoman," Leavitt had declared moments earlier, her voice sharp and practiced, designed for the clip that would go viral by sundown. "The American people deserve better than Democratic talking points about an economy that's failing them. So let's settle this, right here, right now." The room fell silent. Staffers froze mid-keystroke. Republican members exchanged knowing glances. This was the moment Leavitt had been building toward, the viral confrontation that would cement her status as the GOP's rising star, the fearless conservative communicator who could take on the Democratic establishment and win. But across the aisle, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 42, former civil rights attorney, freshman Democrat from Texas's 30th District, adjusted her microphone with the calm precision of someone who had dismantled far more formidable opponents in courtrooms across the South. Her gold blazer caught the overhead lights. Her expression didn't change. She placed her reading glasses on the table, her movements deliberate, almost surgical. And then she looked directly into the camera. Challenge accepted. What happened in the next 90 seconds wouldn't just go viral. It would redefine both of their careers and remind a fractured nation what political debate looks like when facts meet fury. To understand the devastation that was about to unfold, you need to understand who these two women were and why their confrontation was inevitable. Karoline Leavitt had become a household name in conservative circles almost overnight. At just 24, she had served as assistant press secretary in the Trump White House, where she honed her ability to deflect hostile questions, craft soundbites, and dominate the news cycle. After Trump left office, she ran for Congress in New Hampshire's 1st District in 2022. She lost, but her fierce loyalty to Trump, her media savvy, and her willingness to fight earned her a coveted position as senior spokesperson for the House Republican Conference. Leavitt was everything the new GOP wanted: young, telegenic, unapologetically MAGA, and utterly fearless in front of a camera. She had mastered the art of the viral moment, the kind of confrontational, high-energy exchanges that lit up Fox News primetime and conservative Twitter feeds. Her strategy was simple: go on offense, stay on message, never apologize, and always leave your opponent reeling. She had studied the greats. She knew how to bait Democrats into defensive postures. She knew how to turn a hearing into a spectacle. And she genuinely believed that her aggressive style and media instincts could overwhelm any opponent, no matter how prepared. Jasmine Crockett came from a different world entirely. Before entering politics, Crockett had built a reputation as one of Texas's most formidable civil rights attorneys. She had fought and won high-profile cases involving voting rights, police misconduct, and systemic discrimination. She had learned her craft in hostile courtrooms, facing judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys who underestimated her until it was far too late. When she entered the Texas state legislature, she gained national attention for her passionate, fact-driven advocacy during the state's brutal voting rights battles. Her speeches went viral not because they were theatrical, but because they were devastating in their precision. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She presented evidence, cited law, and dismantled arguments with the methodical efficiency of a surgeon. When she ran for Congress in 2022, she won decisively. And when she arrived in Washington, her colleagues, many of them seasoned politicians, decades her senior, elected her president of the Democratic freshman class. It was an extraordinary honor, reflecting not just respect, but genuine awe at her command of policy and debate. Crockett didn't do political theater. She didn't chase viral moments. She came to hearings with binders full of data, reports from the Congressional Research Service, and a legal mind trained to anticipate every counter-argument 3 moves in advance. And now, Karoline Leavitt, confident, aggressive, and convinced she had just set the perfect trap, was about to discover what happens when media instincts meet courtroom discipline. The House Oversight Committee hearing on economic policy had been tense all morning. Republicans had spent hours grilling Treasury Department officials about inflation, blaming the Biden administration for rising prices and economic anxiety. Democrats had countered with data on job creation, infrastructure investments, and declining unemployment. It was the usual partisan back and forth until Karoline Leavitt took the witness stand. She had been invited to testify, a Republican communication strategist, and her testimony was a master class in conservative messaging. She spoke about families struggling to afford groceries. She invoked small business owners crushed by inflation. She painted a picture of an America in crisis and placed the blame squarely on Democratic economic policies. When it was Congresswoman Crockett's turn to question her, she began methodically, pressing Leavitt on specific claims about job numbers and inflation trends. Leavitt responded with the kind of polished talking points that had made her a Fox News favorite but avoided engaging with the actual data. Crockett's frustration was subtle, but visible. She wasn't getting answers, she was getting spin. And that's when Leavitt saw her opening. "Congresswoman," Leavitt interrupted, leaning forward with a smile that had been designed for this exact moment. "With all due respect, I've heard enough of your partisan talking points. The American people deserve better than Democratic spin about an economy that's crushing them." She paused, letting the cameras zoom in. "Let's settle this right now. A direct debate about Biden's economic record. Right here. Right now." The chamber fell silent. This wasn't standard protocol. Witnesses didn't challenge members of Congress to debates. But Leavitt had calculated the risk and decided the reward was worth it. A viral confrontation, a moment that would dominate conservative media. A chance to expose a Democratic rising star as unprepared and outmatched. The committee chairman looked uncertain. Republican members leaned forward, anticipating the spectacle, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who had faced down Texas Republicans trying to suppress voting rights, who had cross-examined hostile witnesses in federal court, who had never once backed down from a fight when truth was on her side, removed her glasses and placed them on the table. Challenge accepted. The destruction. 90 seconds that changed everything. What happened next wasn't a debate. It was an autopsy. "Miss Leavitt," Crockett began, her Texas accent more pronounced than usual, "since you've invited this debate on President Biden's economic record, let's proceed with fact rather than sound bites." She gestured to the committee clerk. "I'd like to enter into the record the Bureau of Labor Statistics' latest employment report, the Congressional Budget Office Economic Outlook, and the Federal Reserve's Monetary Policy Report from last month." Leavitt's confident smile flickered. This wasn't the flustered response she had anticipated. "First point of debate," Crockett continued, arranging 3 documents in front of her with the precision of a trial attorney presenting evidence. "You testified earlier that, and I quote, Biden's economy has been a disaster for working Americans, with the worst inflation in more than 40 years. She looked up, her expression calm but unrelenting. "That's a compelling soundbite, Miss Leavitt. But it's not accurate." Crockett held up a graph from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Inflation peaked at 9.1% in June 2022. As of last month's report, it has declined to 3.4%. That's a 63% reduction. She looked directly at Leavitt. "Would you care to explain to this committee and the American people watching at home why you failed to mention this significant improvement?" Leavitt leaned forward quickly. "Because working Americans are still suffering." "I'm not finished," Crockett interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. "You challenged me to a debate, and debates have rules. I'll give you time to respond after I complete my point." The committee chairman, sensing the unusual dynamic, nodded slightly. This was already deviating from standard procedure, but the challenge had come from the witness. Crockett continued, her rhythm relentless. "Now, Regarding prices being higher, yes, that's how inflation works. But context matters. Global inflation after the pandemic affected every major economy. The United States has actually recovered faster than most peer nations. She slid a comparative chart forward. The European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada all experienced higher, more persistent inflation than the United States under the Biden administration's policies. Leavitt shifted in her seat, papers rustling as she searched for her own statistics. My second point, Crockett pressed on, you stated in your testimony that Biden's economy has cost American jobs and opportunities. Yet the data shows the Biden administration has overseen the creation of over 14 million jobs, a record for any presidential term, with unemployment at a sustained 50-year low of 3.7%. She paused, letting that sink in. For context, the previous administration saw a net loss of jobs by the end of their term, the first presidency with negative job growth since Herbert Hoover during the Great Depression. The comparison drew murmurs from the Democratic side of the days. Leavitt's face flushed slightly as she jotted notes furiously. Miss Leavitt, Crockett said, her tone almost sympathetic now, are you suggesting that record job creation and historically low unemployment constitute costing American jobs? I'm genuinely trying to understand your definition of economic success. Leavitt's response came quickly, defensively. The jobs numbers are manipulated. They don't count people who've given up looking for work altogether. And these aren't good jobs, they're part-time, low-wage positions. That's incorrect on multiple levels, Crockett interjected, holding up another document. The Bureau of Labor Statistics accounts for discouraged workers in their U6 unemployment metric, which is also near historic lows. And regarding manufacturing specifically, double quotes, she slid forward a report from the National Association of Manufacturers. Manufacturing employment has increased by over 800,000 jobs since January 2021. That's the fastest growth in nearly 30 years. She looked pointedly at Leavitt. These are verifiable facts, Miss Leavitt, not partisan talking points. The camera caught Leavitt's expression, surprise giving way to growing concern. This clearly wasn't the exchange she had envisioned when issuing her challenge. My third point, Crockett continued, picking up another document, addresses your claim that Biden's reckless spending caused the inflation crisis. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and multiple independent economists have attributed inflation primarily to pandemic-related supply chain disruptions, pent-up consumer demand after lockdowns, and global energy price shocks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. She held up a chart showing inflation rates alongside major global events. Notice how inflation began rising globally before the American Rescue Plan passed and how it accelerated across all developed economies simultaneously following the Ukraine invasion. Leavitt attempted to interrupt, but Crockett raised her hand slightly. You'll have your turn, Miss Leavitt. You wanted a debate. This is how formal debates work. The chairman checked his watch, seemingly impressed by the substantive exchange despite its unusual format. Furthermore, Crockett said, her voice building momentum, if government spending were the primary driver of inflation, as you claim, then we would expect to see inflation continuing to rise, or remaining elevated as the Biden administration implemented the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Instead, we've seen inflation consistently decreasing while these investments are being made. She turned to face Leavitt directly. Which brings me to perhaps the most important point, results. Crockett held up a series of economic indicators. Since President Biden took office, we have the highest small business creation rate in American history. Wages are growing faster than inflation, especially for lower-income workers. Manufacturing investment has reached a 50-year high. And unlike the previous administration, these economic gains have been broadly shared across demographic groups. The committee room had grown completely silent. Even typically distracted members were now fully engaged in the exchange. Now, Miss Leavitt, Crockett said, her tone shifting slightly, you're entitled to criticize any policy. That's your right as an American and your role as a political communicator. But when you present your opinions as facts and when those statements directly contradict verifiable economic data, you do the American people a disservice. Leavitt, visibly flustered but determined to regain control, leaned forward. The American people don't care about your cherry-picked statistics, Congresswoman. They care about what they're experiencing every day at the grocery store and the gas pump. I appreciate your concern for American families, Miss Leavitt. I share it deeply, Crockett interjected. But that's precisely why accuracy matters. She picked up a final document. This is today's Consumer Sentiment Report from the University of Michigan. Consumer confidence has reached its highest level since 2021, increasing for the fourth straight month. Americans are feeling more optimistic about the economy, not less. She looked directly into the camera. And regarding kitchen table issues, the Biden administration has capped insulin costs for seniors at $35 per month, allowed Medicare to negotiate lower prescription drug prices for the first time, and expanded healthcare coverage to record levels. These are tangible benefits for working families, Leavitt interjected, her voice rising slightly. But what about the trillions in new debt from these spending packages? Who's going to pay for that? Our children and grandchildren will be burdened. I'm glad you raised the debt issue, Crockett said, seeming almost pleased by the interruption. She held up a graph showing deficit trends. The annual deficit has decreased by over 50% under this administration, the largest deficit reduction of any presidency in American history. By comparison, the previous administration increased the deficit by nearly $8 trillion even before the pandemic. Leavitt's face had transitioned from confidence to visible frustration. The challenge that was supposed to create her viral moment was instead becoming a master class in political communication from her opponent. Crockett glanced at the timer. I see we're nearing the end of my allotted time. So let me conclude by addressing the fundamental question. Are we where we want to be economically? No, of course not. There's always more work to do. But are we in a Biden economic disaster, as you've characterized it? She gathered her documents together. The data simply doesn't support that conclusion. She looked directly at Leavitt. Miss Leavitt, you challenged me to this debate because you believed Democratic policies couldn't stand up to scrutiny. I've provided verifiable facts from nonpartisan sources. The American people deserve this level of substantive discussion rather than inflammatory rhetoric. Crockett looked up at the chairman. I yield back the remainder of my time. But I'm certainly open to continuing this discussion if Miss Leavitt would like to respond with specific data rather than generalized talking points. The camera panned to Leavitt, who was hurriedly consulting with a staff member who had passed her a note. The committee room remained silent, awaiting her response to Crockett's devastating, fact-based dismantling of her economic arguments. The committee chairman cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. Miss Leavitt, would you like to respond to Congresswoman Crockett's points? Everyone present recognized they were witnessing something rare, genuine substance cutting through the usual political theater. Karoline Leavitt straightened her papers and leaned toward the microphone. Her voice, typically confident and assertive, had a slightly higher pitch than usual. What the American people need to understand is that Democrats will always find statistics to justify their failed policies. Point of order, Mr. Chairman, Crockett interjected calmly. I believe Miss Leavitt challenged me to a debate on economic facts, not partisan characterizations. I've presented data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Congressional Budget Office, and other nonpartisan sources. I'd welcome a substantive rebuttal to any specific point I've made. Several Democratic committee members nodded in agreement. Even a few Republican representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The chairman turned back to Leavitt. The point is well taken. Miss Leavitt, do you have specific data that contradicts what Congresswoman Crockett has presented? Leavitt shuffled through her notes. The inflation numbers don't reflect the real experience. Respectfully, Crockett interrupted again. I believe Miss Leavitt is about to reference perception polling rather than economic data. While public sentiment is important, it doesn't contradict the actual economic indicators I've presented. A murmur ran through the committee room. A senior Republican congressman leaned over to whisper to a colleague, the C-SPAN microphone barely picking up. She walked right into this. Leavitt, increasingly flustered, tried a different approach. Congresswoman, these may be the official numbers, but they don't tell the whole story. The Biden administration has manipulated. That's an extraordinary claim, Crockett responded, her voice steady but with an edge of steel. Are you suggesting that career economists at the Bureau of Labor Statistics are falsifying federal data? That would be a serious accusation requiring evidence. Leavitt backtracked quickly. I'm saying that these numbers don't reflect reality for everyday Americans. I do talk to families in my district regularly, Crockett countered. And you're right that many are still feeling economic pressure. But that's precisely why honesty about our economic situation matters. She held up another document. This report shows that grocery prices have increased 25% since 2019, with the sharpest increases occurring during the pandemic supply chain disruptions of 2020 to 2021. The rate of increase has slowed significantly over the past year. She looked directly at Leavitt. Americans deserve accurate information about both our challenges and our progress, not exaggerations in either direction. After what seemed like an eternity, Leavitt finally replied, her voice smaller now. No, I don't dispute the specific numbers, but I interpret their impact differently. A subtle smile played at the corner of Crockett's mouth. Then we've made progress. We agree on the facts, but differ on their interpretation. That's a much more productive conversation than questioning the data itself. She turned to face the committee. Mr. Chairman, I believe I've addressed Ms. Leavitt's challenge to debate the economic record. The facts speak for themselves. Record job creation, manufacturing revival, declining inflation, historic deficit reduction, improving consumer confidence. These aren't partisan talking points, they're verifiable economic indicators from trusted nonpartisan sources. She gathered her documents into a neat stack. Ms. Leavitt is entitled to her interpretation of these facts, but not to her own alternative facts. The American people deserve honest debate based on shared reality, not political theater. The chairman nodded. Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett. As the hearing moved on, the damage was already done. Congressional staffers were furiously typing on their phones. Reporters in the gallery were rushing to file stories. And social media was beginning to light up with clips of the exchange. In just under 90 seconds of actual debate time from Crockett's challenge accepted to Leavitt's admission that she didn't dispute the economic data, the entire dynamic had shifted. What had been intended as Leavitt's moment to shine had instead become a showcase for Crockett's command of economic policy and debate skills. The destruction had been complete, efficient, and by the standards of congressional hearings, almost merciful in its brevity. By the time Congresswoman Crockett exited the hearing room 3 hours later, the exchange had already transcended the typical boundaries of congressional proceedings. Outside, reporters swarmed her. Congresswoman, did you anticipate Miss Leavitt's challenge? Crockett paused, adjusting her glasses with a slight smile. In politics, you should always expect the unexpected. But I believe that, when you're discussing economic policy, the facts should lead the conversation. The American people deserve substance, not theater. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt had exited through a side door, avoiding the press entirely. On social media, the exchange exploded. The original C-SPAN clip had been viewed over 2 million times within 3 hours. Hashtags like number 90 Secon destruction, hashtag Crockett receipts, and hashtag Facts Matter began trending nationally. CNN's Anderson Cooper opened his evening broadcast with the clip. What we just witnessed was extraordinary not for its theatrics, but precisely because it cut through the usual political theater with actual substance. David Axelrod, the veteran Democratic strategist, nodded in agreement on the panel. What makes this remarkable is that Congresswoman Crockett didn't respond with partisan rhetoric. She responded with specific, verifiable economic data. And when you're armed with facts, you don't need to shout. Even on Fox News, the assessment was surprisingly candid. Leavitt made a tactical error, commented Brett Baer. She issued a challenge without being fully prepared for the response. In politics, as in chess, you need to think several moves ahead. By evening, Democratic leaders were highlighting Crockett's performance, emblematic of their approach to governance. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries tweeted, "This is what Democratic leadership looks like: prepared, substantive, focused on actual results for the American people." Republicans largely avoided direct comments, with most focusing on other aspects of the hearing or broader economic messaging. But the exchange had particular resonance for Black women in politics, many of whom saw in Crockett's performance a familiar dynamic: being underestimated, then proving exceptional preparation and competence when challenged. Professor Melissa Harris-Berry noted on MSNBC, "What we witnessed today was a Black woman who came not just prepared, but over-prepared, because that's what Black women in professional settings often feel compelled to do." And today, that preparation paid off spectacularly. 6 months later, the exchange continued to shape both women's political trajectories. Jasmine Crockett's national profile had risen substantially. She had been given increased committee responsibilities and frequent media appearances focused on economic policy. Democratic leadership increasingly called on her to make the case for their economic agenda, recognizing her unique ability to communicate complex policy in accessible terms while maintaining factual rigor. Karoline Leavitt, showing political resilience, had adapted her approach. While maintaining her conservative principles, she had noticeably shifted toward more policy-focused messaging, often coming to hearings with specific data points and substantive arguments rather than purely rhetorical flourishes. In a profile piece, she acknowledged the lesson learned: in politics, there's always a temptation to focus on creating moments rather than making arguments. That exchange reminded me that substance matters. Perhaps most significantly, the confrontation had established a new standard, at least temporarily, for political exchanges. In subsequent committee hearings, members from both parties appeared more hesitant to rely solely on talking points, with increased emphasis on bringing specific data and evidence to support their positions. The 90-second destruction had become more than a viral moment. It had, however, briefly shifted the incentive structure of political discourse towards substance over performance. As political scientist Robert Putnam observed in a New York Times op-ed, "In a healthy democracy, facts aren't partisan. They're the common ground from which meaningful debate can proceed." What we witnessed in that remarkable 90-second exchange wasn't the triumph of one political party over another. It was the triumph of factual discourse over empty rhetoric. And that's a victory for American democracy itself. For Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Karoline Leavitt, the exchange would forever link their political narratives, serving as either a defining triumph or a valuable lesson, depending on perspective. But for the broader political culture, it offered a glimpse of what political debate could be at its best: fact-based, substantive, and focused on the actual impact of policies on American lives. As another election cycle approached and political rhetoric intensified, clips of those 90 seconds continued to circulate, a reminder that when political theater gives way to political substance, everyone, regardless of partisan affiliation, has the opportunity to be better informed about the choices that shape our collective future. If this story moved you, if you believe truth deserves witnesses, hit like, share this video, and subscribe. Because in a world drowning in spin, facts still matter. And voices like Jasmine Crockett's remind us why.